Donald Trump had walked into the congressional hearing with the same arsenal he had always relied on: sharp-tongued jabs, disdainful tone, and an unshakable belief that volume equals victory. He was ready to bulldoze through another public challenge with theatrical dominance. What he didn't count on was Jasmine Crockett. Her response wasn't loud or animated. It was cold steel, controlled, precise, and devastatingly effective. In just 7 minutes, she managed to shift the air in the room, cracking the performance armor that Trump had worn like a second skin. There wasn't an explosion. It was quieter than that, more surgical. A word, delivered with the finesse of a seasoned trial lawyer, sliced clean through Trump's bravado. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a revelation, a moment where substance outshone spectacle and exposed a vulnerability that even his staunchest allies couldn't deny. The hearing. Room felt sterile under the fluorescent lights, yet the tension was palpable. Stark shadows carved sharp lines into the faces of committee members. The whirring of camera lenses and the muffled tapping of reporters' keyboards formed the undercurrent of a televised showdown. The polished table where Crockett sat gleamed beneath the overhead lights, its cool surface contrasting with the heat brewing inside the room. Even the remnants of break-time coffee and lingering perfumes clashed in the air, creating a scent that felt oddly human amid all the institutional posturing. Jasmine Crockett, 44, exuded a calm that didn't beg for attention. It demanded respect. With a deliberate hand, she arranged her documents, every flick of a page done with intention. Her navy suit was sharp and unflinching, tailored to communicate not style, but seriousness. The gold pin resting on her lapel wasn't a fashion statement. It was a silent nod to her constitutional duty. Where others saw vulnerability in her manicure or glasses, she had turned them into shields, symbols of defiance and strength. Every detail about her presence whispered one thing: I am not here to perform. I am here to confront. On the massive monitor in the room, Trump's image loomed. Remote yet dominating, he moved with the confidence of a man used to being the loudest voice in the room. His red tie glared against the neutral backdrop like a warning flare. He gestured dramatically, convinced that the camera angle, carefully chosen to boost his sense of command, would do the usual trick. His expressions alternated rapidly between smirk and sneer, a rhythm as familiar to the American public as his slogans. The room had been constructed to project order and hierarchy. The placement of chairs, the elevated seats, the towering emblem, all signaled a rigid chain of command. Yet something was shifting. The journalists, normally detached, sensed it too. A storm was brewing, not through shouting or spectacle, but through something far more unnerving: strategic poise. Crockett wasn't just bringing law degrees and titles to this table. She carried the scars of a life spent navigating rooms that weren't built for her. A former civil rights lawyer, a public defender, she had learned not only how power operated but how it excluded. She had been hardened by judges who dismissed her, clients who tested her, and systems that thrived on diminishing voices like hers. Where some people cracked under pressure, she had refined her edge. Calm was no longer a choice, it was a weapon. She had been laughed at, dismissed, ridiculed for her appearance, her voice, her confidence. From jabs about her eyelashes to underhanded attacks on her intelligence, Crockett had heard it all. And, with each attack, she'd gotten sharper. She had learned that silence could scream louder than shouting, that holding a gaze could do more damage than hurling insults, and that truth, when timed right, could be fatal. So when she reached for her water glass and her hand trembled slightly, it wasn't fear. It was the gravity of knowing this moment wasn't just a political exchange, it was a reckoning. Trump represented more than one man. He stood in for an entire system that confused arrogance with leadership, that amplified its voice to silence others. His style was predictable: belittle, distract, deny. It had worked for decades. But against Jasmine Crockett, it was about to fall apart. She didn't rely on theatrics. Her preparation was her power. Every folder in front of her contained not only facts, but an intentional structure, a story built through data, time-stamped and bulletproof. While Trump leaned on instinct and repetition, she was armed with strategy and foresight. The night before, while he likely rehearsed insults, she was plotting escape routes from his diversions, rehearsing not just her questions, but every possible deflection. This was more than a job for her. It was personal. Raised in St. Louis, she had seen the cost of bad policies in real life. Her mother, a lifelong public school teacher, had taught her that truth didn't need a spotlight to matter. It needed resolve. They may be louder, her mother used to say, but they'll never have more truth, unless you let them. Trump's tactics were familiar. Attack the person, not the argument. He questioned competence. He mocked appearances. He weaponized language. And because so many let it slide, he never had to change. When challenged, he grew louder, throwing tantrums dressed as patriotism. But this wasn't just about today. It was about a broader battle, about how authority was defined in public life. Was it earned through facts, or claimed through force? Was it about what you knew or how loud you could say it? Across the country, people were watching closely, especially women, especially black women. In Crockett's silence and her composure, they recognized the unspoken calculus they had performed 1,000 times in rooms that tried to ignore them. The moment Trump leaned into his signature belittling tone, beginning with, "Congresswoman, I'm not sure someone like you should waste our time," the entire room paused. Cameras tightened their focus. The air stiffened. And Crockett, unflinching, let 3 seconds pass. 3 deliberate, echoing seconds. She didn't blink. She didn't rush to respond. She didn't react. She made him wait. That deliberate pause, that quiet defiance, made televisions across the nation go still. Households froze mid-bite. Phones stopped scrolling. Something had shifted. Then, with the precision of someone who had practiced this very moment, she answered, "Thank you, Mr. President, for your presence today." Her tone was crisp, unemotional, yet undeniably assertive. "You mentioned the importance of time, efficiency specifically. I believe that's exactly where we should begin." She didn't acknowledge the insult. She didn't let it land. By ignoring the bait and steering the dialogue toward her terms, she sent a message more powerful than any rebuke. She would not let the hearing spiral into a circus of personal attacks. She would control the rhythm. Trump's smirk faltered for a breath, only to reassert itself with the confidence of someone used to controlling every room he entered, whether physically or virtually. He leaned into the camera, voice rising. "Efficiency? Let's talk about that. No administration in history ran as smoothly, spent as wisely, or acted as effectively as mine." His hands moved emphatically, chopping the air in familiar patterns. Each gesture was an assertion of dominance, a physical attempt to overwhelm through sheer energy. But Crockett wasn't moved. She opened the first folder. Not hurriedly, not nervously, methodically. Anyone who had ever sat across from an antagonistic boss, an unrelenting client, a hostile authority figure, anyone who had experienced gaslighting cloaked in charm, recognized what she was doing. She was shifting the tempo. She wasn't just asking questions. She was laying a trap. "Would you agree," she began calmly, "that efficient governance begins with precise records? That managing human lives, especially vulnerable ones, demands a level of detail that cannot be optional?" "Of course," Trump replied, puffing up. "I ran a global empire. Nobody understands tracking better than me, not even close." Crockett gave the faintest nod, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a signal to those paying attention. He had just walked straight into her structure. "Then," she said, turning to a highlighted page, "let's look at an April 2018 memo from your Department of Homeland Security. According to their internal assessment, quote, current systems are inadequate for linking children with parents post-separation." End quote. She looked up, her tone still neutral, her face unreadable. "Were you briefed on this?" The silence hit differently now. Trump leaned back slightly. "My people told me everything was fine. If something slipped, it was the fault of the bureaucrats, not us." Crockett didn't challenge the deflection directly. She simply acknowledged it. Understood. So your team provided you with incomplete information. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but those familiar with litigation heard it instantly. By reframing his defense as an admission of poor internal communication, she had introduced a new kind of failure, executive ignorance. And then she continued. In June 2018, a federal judge issued an order requiring the reunification of all separated families. Your Health and Human Services Secretary testified under oath that a centralized database existed and that every child could be accounted for. She paused, just long enough for that claim to settle. But the very next day, she said, holding up another sheet, your administration filed a court document stating, and I quote, "There is no integrated database tracking separated families across agencies." End quote. The contradiction was brutal, not in tone. In fact, that's what made it hit harder. She didn't raise her voice. She let the papers do the screaming. Trump began to speak, but there was no ground to stand on. "We fixed it," he said quickly. "Everything got resolved. The problems were from the Obama era. We inherited chaos." Crockett scribbled something on her pad. Not much, just a short note. But it was enough. The gesture was symbolic, a visual cue to the room that his words were now part of the record, evaluated, documented, dissected. Respectfully, she continued, as of January 2023, court documents state over 1,000 children remain unreunited with their parents. That's 5 years later. Would you still characterize that as a temporary setback? Trump blinked. For a man used to bluster and booming rhetoric, numbers could be inconvenient. Those are exaggerated. Fake numbers by fake people. We had control. The real chaos started after I left office. Another pivot, another deflection. But Crockett wasn't giving him a way out. She returned to her notes. You've said repeatedly that your administration operated with exceptional efficiency. Yet according to your own Inspector General's report from 2019, your administration's failure to integrate systems between CBP, ICE, and HHS created avoidable costs and delays. How do you reconcile that with your earlier claim? The air shifted. People in the gallery sat straighter. Even the journalists stopped typing for a beat. Trump's reply was defensive, increasingly so. We were under pressure. It was a crisis. What mattered is we acted. We made the hard choices. And yet, his argument kept circling back to blame. Crockett leaned slightly forward, not in aggression but in composure. The zero-tolerance policy was signed by your own Attorney General. It wasn't inherited. It was initiated. The timeline is clear. Would you still describe it as a problem left over from a previous administration? Trump opened his mouth, but Crockett cut him off gently by presenting yet another document. This time, a budget breakdown. She read aloud, family, separation, $775 per person per day. Family detention, $298. Alternatives, $58. From a fiscal perspective, how is that an example of efficient use of taxpayer dollars? The numbers weren't just numbers. They were daggers, Trump answered, but the tone had changed. His voice carried more strain. Those numbers don't account for deterrence. We saved money by preventing future crossings. Crockett nodded slightly, like a teacher letting a student speak before correcting the logic. Yet border crossings rose by 14% in the 3 months following the policy's rollout. This according to your own CBP data. The contradiction was now loud enough for the entire room to hear, even though she never raised her voice. It was clear she wasn't trying to win a soundbite. She was building something larger, and Donald Trump for once didn't know where the exit was. Trump's tone grew sharper. These are cherry-picked numbers, short-term changes. You're ignoring the bigger picture. What we did at the border was working until the current administration ruined it. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She let the words fall flat, gave them space to echo, and then calmly returned to her page. Mr. President, she began, I understand your desire to focus on the present. However, this committee's job is to review executive actions, past and present, for the sake of accountability. It's not about assigning blame, it's about ensuring mistakes don't repeat themselves. Her voice was steady, not as a defense but as a declaration. She wasn't arguing with him, she was reminding him, and the room, why they were there. She pulled out another folder. This filing, dated February 2023, contains sworn testimony from your administration's officials. According to them, critical spreadsheets used to track separated families were destroyed during the handoff between agencies. There was no raise in her tone, no dramatic flair, just the weight of words spoken with confidence. Would you characterize that kind of document destruction as consistent with efficient administrative practice? The shift in the room was immediate. It was no longer about incompetence. It had entered the realm of potential wrongdoing. This wasn't a matter of mismanagement. It was a question of intent. Trump's expression tightened. Those accusations are false. More lies from angry people looking to hurt my legacy. If anything was lost, it was by career officials who never supported my policies. But Crockett didn't engage in debate. She allowed him to speak, and when he stopped, she moved forward with calm persistence. Understood. So your position is that the records were either lost unintentionally or that others deliberately removed them without your knowledge. Her words, again, carried no accusation, just clarity. But the implication was obvious. Either gross negligence or a cover-up. Let me ask you this, she continued. The officials who gave this testimony were your appointees. Their statements were made under oath. Are you suggesting they committed perjury? The question sliced deeper than any insult could. Trump hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. They were probably pressured. People twist words. Everyone in governments, afraid of getting sued or blamed. For the first time, his voice lacked the firm certitude he had carried at the start. He wasn't delivering sound bites anymore. He was grasping for explanations. Crockett didn't push. She just let the silence hang. Then she resumed, each line like a building block in a carefully constructed case. This document, from your Office of Management and Budget in 2018, details the cost breakdown of the family separation program. According to it, detaining children separately cost significantly more than alternative methods. She read from the page. $775 per person per day, compared to $298 for family detention, and $58 for supervised release with ankle monitoring. Then she looked up. Her tone never shifted. From a budgetary standpoint, do you believe doubling, even tripling, the cost per person was a fiscally responsible decision? Trump jumped on the question like a lifeline. You're ignoring the deterrence value. We saved money in the long run by stopping illegal crossings. This is a drop in the bucket compared to the cost of an open border. Crockett raised a single eyebrow, just enough to show she was listening, not buying. I appreciate the explanation, but your own Customs and Border Protection data contradicts that. According to them, border crossings increased by 14% in the 3 months following the announcement of your policy. Her voice remained matter-of-fact. She wasn't pressing, she wasn't arguing, she was laying stones. So again, would you say the policy achieved the deterrence effect you described? Trump began to circle the topic. It's not about just a few months. The broader trend was positive. We brought order, we sent a message. But now the border is a disaster. You should be investigating that. The volume rose, not the logic. His answer no longer targeted the question. It lashed out at the environment around it. The classic pivot. When cornered, changed the conversation. But Crockett didn't let him. Respectfully, she said, this committee isn't ignoring the present, but oversight demands we address what happened under your leadership as well. She wasn't lecturing, she was anchoring the discussion. Then came the next blow. This 2023 court filing indicates that your administration not only lacked tracking systems, but, according to sworn testimony, intentionally removed and deleted key documents before the transition. Would you consider that accidental mismanagement or deliberate obstruction? The language was legal, surgical. There was no flourish, no fire, just cold, clean exposure. Trump's voice dropped to a defensive pitch. That's outrageous. More attacks. People have been trying to take me down for years. It's the same witch hunt. But even as he spoke, the energy had shifted. The phrase witch hunt had lost its sting. The more he repeated it, the less weight it carried. Crockett let the silence return. "Mr. President," she said finally, "your defense has included repeated references to inherited problems, uncooperative bureaucrats, and political persecution. But the evidence before us, produced by your own departments, tells a consistent story." She paused, letting each word sink in. A story of decisions made, systems ignored, and consequences denied. Trump crossed his arms on screen. He was quiet for once, not silenced, just stalled. Crockett leaned forward, not out of aggression but with purpose. "You often say, 'The buck stops with me.' You published a book about leadership. So I ask you, is there any part of this policy's implementation that you're willing to claim as your responsibility?" The question didn't accuse. It invited. It offered him a chance to stand up, to own something. Trump shifted. "I took responsibility for securing the border. That's more than any Democrat ever did. We enforced the law. And then, inevitably, came the attack. You just don't understand the reality at the border. You read reports, I made decisions." A personal jab, thinly veiled, a pivot back to dismissal. But Crockett didn't take the bait. She smiled faintly. "I appreciate your concern for my background. Before Congress, I worked as a civil rights attorney and public defender, representing immigrant communities firsthand." Then, with a gentle but firm pivot, she added, "But today isn't about either of our resumes, it's about the record, the administrative record of your government." She didn't need to say more about her past, just enough to anchor credibility and then pull the spotlight right back to where it belonged, the documents. Without fanfare, she turned another page. "This budget analysis was prepared by your Office of Management and Budget, dated September 2018. It outlines the cost disparity between three options: separation, detention, and monitored release." She let the numbers do the damage. Separation cost $775 per individual, per day. Family. Detention cost $298 and supervised release, just $58. Trump shifted. The silence around him was louder than any insult. "Tell me, Mr. President, strictly from a financial perspective, how is choosing the most expensive option while generating the most legal backlash a sign of efficiency?" He bristled, adjusting in his chair. "You're missing the bigger picture. That policy saved us billions by preventing millions from trying to cross. You can't reduce border security to a spreadsheet." Crockett gave the briefest of nods. "So, if I understand you correctly, your defense of the higher cost is based on the assumption of long-term deterrence?" "Exactly," Trump shot back, his confidence surging again. "That's what good leadership does. It looks ahead." But she wasn't finished. "In that case," she said, opening another document, "let's examine your own customs and border protection data. According to their records, border crossings increased by 14% in the 3 months after the family separation policy was implemented. A single number dropped into the room like a stone into still water. She let it ripple. "I'm curious, Mr. President, how does that align with the deterrence effect you just cited?" Trump blinked. "Those are short-term fluctuations. Real results take time. We had everything under control before the pandemic disrupted everything. It was familiar. Redirect? Inflate blame." But Crockett didn't respond with a counter-accusation. She simply opened another folder. "This court record from February 2023 indicates that your administration failed to reunite over 1,000 children with their parents, even 5 years after separation." She looked up, her gaze steady. "You've used the phrase eventually accounted for. Would you still apply that phrase when over 1,000 children remain unreunited after half a decade?" The air in the room grew denser, not because of heat, but because everyone could feel what that question carried. This wasn't about abstract numbers anymore. These were children, still waiting. Trump leaned in, almost growling. "Those figures are fake, made up to embarrass me. The real problem is what's happening now. Chaos, a total invasion at the border. But you don't want to talk about that, do you?" His voice rose. But Crockett didn't respond in kind. She waited, 3 beats, then calmly continued. I'd like to bring us back to the efficiency metrics we agreed were important. She didn't argue the deflection, she simply ignored it. And by doing so, she rendered it irrelevant. According to these same court documents, over $20 million of taxpayer money was spent solely to locate and attempt reunification of families who were initially separated under your policy. Would you consider that an efficient use of government resources? The framing was flawless. Trump's narrative of cost-saving strength was now being held against the exact figures his own government had produced. That's not accurate, he snapped. Those numbers are inflated, just another attempt to drag me down. We saved billions elsewhere. These figures are nonsense. Crockett tilted her head slightly, then retrieved one more folder. This report is from your own Department of Homeland Security, dated November 2019. It states, and I quote, "The lack of integration between CBP, ICE, and HHS tracking systems impeded efforts to identify and reunify separated families, leading to significant and avoidable administrative costs." She let that quote sit there, unchallenged. This isn't from critics, sir. It's from your own Inspector General. Trump opened his mouth, then paused. The space between her statement and his response widened. It wasn't just silence, it was paralysis. They were under pressure, he finally muttered. The whole system was strained. We did the best we could with what we inherited. But even as he said it, the narrative no longer held. Crockett's eyes didn't harden. They didn't narrow. They simply stayed steady. You've referenced inherited issues multiple times today. And yet, the policy of zero tolerance, the directive that initiated family separation, was formally announced by your Attorney General in April 2018, more than a year into your term. She flipped the page to reveal the memo. His signature, his date, April 6, 2018. She looked up, her tone patient but unrelenting. Help me understand, Mr. President. How does a policy announced and implemented by your own administration qualify as an inherited problem? Trump didn't answer right away. His jaw shifted. He exhaled loudly. They were doing the same thing under Obama, he said at last. They just didn't get caught. Everyone wants to make me the villain for doing what others quietly did. And, then sensing weakness, he pivoted again. Your problem, Congresswoman, is that you read talking points. You don't understand the real stakes. You've never made real decisions, just criticism. It was no longer about policy. It was about her. Crockett didn't flinch. I appreciate your concern for my qualifications, she replied evenly. But I'm not here today to discuss either of our resumes. She waited. I'm here to examine the factual record, the record created by your government, under your leadership. The temperature in the room dropped again, not literally but perceptibly. Crockett's voice wasn't rising, yet it seemed to carry more weight with every passing moment. And Trump, who usually thrived in chaos, now looked like he was swimming. Against a tide that wouldn't stop pulling him back to one thing, the facts. She lifted another document. This email, sourced from your Justice Department and dated July 2018, expresses frustration that HHS lacked records for approximately 700 children, among them, over 100 under the age of 5. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't plead for empathy. She didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Does this reflect the perfect communication you referenced earlier between agencies under your leadership? Trump's response was quick, defensive, familiar. We fixed those issues. These were temporary delays. Bureaucrats slowed everything down, but we fixed it. Crockett didn't challenge the claim. Instead, she clarified the timeline. I want to be very specific, Mr. President. According to federal court filings from January 2023, more than 1,000 children have still not been reunited with their families. That's 5 years after the policy's implementation. She leaned in slightly, not as a threat, but with clarity. So when you say temporary, is 5 years within your definition of temporary? Again, there was that pause, the kind that lets the weight of a question do the damage that a raised voice never could. Trump scoffed. Those numbers are made up by political opponents, people who've wanted to take me down from the beginning. This whole hearing is a stunt. The accusation didn't shake her. She gave him a moment to finish, then returned to the documents. in front of her. Every item I've presented here today, every figure, every quote, originates from your own administration, internal emails, court submissions, inspector general reports. These aren't partisan attacks. They are official government records. Her tone didn't change. If anything, it grew quieter, calmer. But in that calm, there was power. And now, Mr. President, I want to address the issue of deliberate record destruction, something that moves beyond inefficiency and into possible misconduct. The room stilled. Even the background tapping of reporters stopped. This filing from February 2023 states that during the transition between agencies, critical spreadsheets tracking separated families were not just lost, but destroyed. She looked directly at the screen showing Trump. Do you deny that those spreadsheets were destroyed? Trump leaned forward, visibly agitated. If anything was lost, it was because of bad actors inside the agencies, people who never supported what we were doing. We were targeted from day one. Crockett didn't interrupt. She waited. So to be clear, she said, you're suggesting that your own appointed officials, those who testified to the destruction of these records, either lied or acted against your directives? Trump didn't answer immediately. The pause was telling. They were misled, he finally muttered. Or maybe they were pressured by Democrats or activists. You people always twist everything. The phrase "you people" landed like a rock. It didn't provoke Crockett. It didn't rattle her. She didn't even blink. But for many watching, especially women, especially black women, it echoed something they knew all too well. The coded language used to marginalize, to other, to delegitimize. Crockett didn't respond to it directly. She didn't give it oxygen. She let it hang there, exposed. Then after a beat, she continued, Mr. President, throughout this hearing, you've placed blame on career staff, other administrations, the courts, and unnamed enemies. But not once have you acknowledged direct responsibility for the failures we've discussed. Her voice remained unchanged, but the message couldn't have been clearer. You've said you pride yourself on leadership, on taking responsibility. You wrote the phrase, "the buck stops with me." So I'm asking again, do you accept any part of the implementation of this policy as your administration's responsibility? Trump straightened his posture. I took responsibility for securing the border, for enforcing the law. What happened after the orders were given wasn't always perfect, but it wasn't my failure. The real failure is what you people want. Open borders, no enforcement. There it was again. You people. Crockett absorbed it with grace. She didn't push back. She rephrased. Just to clarify, Mr. President, you're saying you accept responsibility for the decision to implement the policy, but not for the administration of that policy. That's correct, he answered without hesitation. And in that moment, Crockett locked in the contradiction. You claim decisive leadership, she said quietly. You own the policy, but disown the result. You accept the signature, but not the consequence. The room grew still again. Mr. President, is that what you believe leadership means? Trump's face tightened. Leadership means doing what's necessary, even when it's unpopular. Crockett tilted her head. Then why, when faced with unpopular outcomes, children still separated, documents destroyed, millions wasted, do you attribute every failing to someone else? He said nothing. Not yet. The silence was long this time. She let the moment hold. Mr. President, I want to be clear, she said finally. The questions I've asked today weren't based on opinion. They were based on fact. Your administration's own words, records, and filings. She looked directly at the monitor one last time. This isn't a partisan attack. It's not personal. It's accountability. The kind that comes not with slogans but with receipts. Trump sat still, blinking at the camera, and for once he didn't have a comeback ready. The hearing room sat in a stillness that felt almost sacred. Crockett's voice had never risen, yet the emotional weight of her questioning had filled every inch of the space. Around her, the atmosphere was not that of a political brawl. It was that of reckoning. She had turned official documents into cross-examination tools, silence into strategy, and dignity into a weapon of accountability. Trump shifted again. His usual shield, sarcasm, was no match for the stream of facts laid bare by his own administration's records. He looked toward the camera like it might save him, but Crockett wasn't done. I want to revisit the definition of efficiency, one you agreed was central to good governance, she said, her voice as even as ever. Would you say destroying tracking spreadsheets for separated families aligns with the values of transparent, efficient leadership? Trump shook his head. Those were procedural errors, minor mistakes. The real inefficiency is what this administration is doing, losing control of the border and wasting billions. Crockett didn't respond to the accusation. She didn't even acknowledge it. She just turned to the next sheet of paper carefully like she was reading off a verdict. This is sworn testimony, she said, holding it up, by your own officials who served under your leadership. They confirmed under oath that spreadsheets were not simply misplaced, but intentionally deleted. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't dramatize the moment. She didn't need to. And since you're challenging their credibility, she continued, are you stating here for the record that your appointees perjured themselves in federal court? The room tensed. That word perjury carried weight. I'm saying they may have been misled, or maybe they're wrong, or scared. You know how the system works. Everyone's afraid of getting canceled if they tell the truth. He was scrambling now, clawing, for anything that could discredit the people who once worked under him. But Crockett didn't press harder. Instead, she leaned back ever so slightly, giving space to the unraveling that was already happening on its own. And then came the pivot. People have been coming after me since the day I came down that escalator, Trump said, voice tinged with bitterness. It's all political. Every question, every hearing, every headline, fake, every bit of it. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't meet fire with fire. She let the phrase, you people, sit there again, ugly, dismissive, coded. She gave it nothing, not even a flicker of recognition. But the pause that followed was deafening. Then softly she said, Mr. President, with all due respect, I haven't once quoted a headline. I've only quoted your own documents. She opened another folder and pulled out the next exhibit. And this one, she said, is a 2019 report from your own Department of Homeland Security's Office of the Inspector General. It explicitly states that the failure to coordinate data systems between CBP, ICE, and HHS caused preventable delays and avoidable costs. She placed the document gently on the table, letting the seal catch the light. This isn't a political opponent speaking. It's your own oversight office. Trump was still shaking his head, muttering about disloyal bureaucrats and biased agencies. But his words were losing altitude, and Crockett kept pressing, not emotionally, but methodically. You've claimed again and again that your administration was the most transparent in history. But when your agency's own records state that vital data was deleted and tracking systems were never integrated, how does that align with transparency? Trump straightened up and delivered a now familiar line. Nobody has ever been treated more unfairly than me. Not in business, not in politics, they all wanted me to fail. Crockett glanced up not with challenge but with something subtler. Resolve. Leadership, she said quietly, isn't about who receives fairness. It's about who delivers it. She paused, letting the distinction land. Let's continue. Her calm had become its own form of gravity, pulling attention away from theatrics and back toward what mattered. This court document from 2023 confirms that many of the internal systems used during the family separation initiative were never subject to audit or oversight. In fact, according to sworn testimony, your agencies lacked even basic protocols to ensure families could be reunited. Then, another pause. Would you consider launching a policy of such scale without integrated oversight mechanisms, a responsible use of executive authority? Trump's face contorted. You don't understand how real leadership works. In crisis, you move fast. You don't sit around waiting for perfect plans, you act. That's what I did, that's why the country was safer. But Crockett didn't let that rhetoric drift too far. I understand urgency, she replied. But urgency without coordination created consequences we're still living with today. She tapped her folder gently. And those consequences weren't hypothetical. They were human. Real children, real families, real suffering. Trump scoffed again, brushing it off. You're making it sound like we just threw kids into cages and forgot about them. Crockett looked up slowly. I don't have to make it sound like anything, she said. Your administration's own reports have already done that. The silence that followed wasn't just powerful, it was respectful. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled, because the truth has already spoken. And then, with the softest voice she had used all day, she added, Authentic leadership, Mr. President, doesn't erase accountability. It embraces it. Trump blinked. The words didn't sting like an insult. They landed like a mirror. Trump leaned forward slightly as if trying to reclaim the upper hand. But the silence surrounding Crockett's final words made any attempted comeback feel thin. The room, though quiet, was buzzing with the weight of what had just been said. He wasn't used to this kind of confrontation. Not the yelling match, not the cable news sparring. This was something else. This was control through composure, and he didn't have a strategy for it. Crockett, meanwhile, was already turning the page. This is a memo from your Office of Management and Budget, she began. It estimates the daily cost of separated family detention at $775. That number stood out not only because of the financial strain, but because it was more than double the cost of housing families together, and more than 13 times the cost of community-based alternatives. She paused, letting the math settle. These aren't partisan numbers, they come from your fiscal analysts, and yet your administration continued with the most expensive and least efficient method. Why? Trump adjusted his seat. Because it worked. Because we needed to show strength. People were flooding in. If we didn't act, it would have been chaos. You wouldn't understand. You've never had to run anything real. There it was again. The pattern. When cornered by facts, pivot to personal attacks, challenge qualifications, undermine, dismiss. But Crockett had no interest in defending her credentials. She simply replied, Let's go back to the data. She pulled another document forward. Border crossings rose by 14% in the 3 months following implementation. Again, according to your CBP. She looked up. If your intention was deterrence, and your policy resulted in increased crossings, how do you define success? Trump opened his mouth, then paused as though searching for a different kind of answer. They were short-term fluctuations. Long-term, we were bringing numbers down before the pandemic. But even he didn't sound convinced. Crockett flipped to a new section of her binder. Let's talk about reunification, she said. Because according to court filings from January 2023, over 1,000 children had still not been reunited with their parents. That's 5 years of separation. Is that what success looks like? Trump's voice raised slightly. They were reunited. Or at least, we tried. People don't understand how hard this is. Records were a mess when we got there. We had to clean it all up. Crockett let that sit. So you're saying you inherited a mess? He nodded. Exactly. She gently tapped the folder in front of her. Then why did your Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, issue a memo in April 2018, well into your term, outlining the zero-tolerance policy that led to these separations? That wasn't an inherited policy. That was a decision. Your decision. Trump tried again. We didn't start the practice. We just enforced the law. Something no one else had the guts to do. And yet, Crockett said softly, enforcing the law without a system to track those impacted, especially children, led to irreversible damage. The silence that followed wasn't angry. It was heavy. A collective acknowledgement of harm, not shouted about but laid out on paper and read aloud, like a national confession. Then came the final pivot Trump had left to try. Redirect to the present. Why aren't you investigating the current administration? He snapped. You want to act like you care so much, but what about what's happening now? The real crisis is happening today, and nobody's talking about that. Crockett nodded slowly. Mr. President, this committee is tasked with oversight. Past, present, and future. That includes your administration. It includes every administration. Our mandate is to examine executive actions. assess harm, and recommend prevention. She paused, then added, "That includes yours." Trump muttered, "It's all politics. You'll never be fair to me." Crockett didn't respond with defense. She returned to her documents. "This," she said, lifting another report, "is from your Office of Inspector General. It explicitly states that poor interagency coordination led to preventable harm, financial waste, and long-term psychological impact on children." She lowered the page, her gaze locked on the screen. "Do you still maintain that your administration operated with maximum efficiency?" Trump hesitated. Then quietly he said, "We did what we had to do." It was the closest he'd come to conceding anything. Crockett leaned in, not to gloat, but to press deeper. "What is leadership?" she asked. "If not the ability to both act and accept responsibility for the outcome of those actions." No answer. She continued, "You've built a brand on the idea that you alone can fix it, that only you have the strength to lead. But here, when faced with the consequences, documents from your own agencies, testimonies from your own appointees, your answer is, someone else failed." Trump narrowed his eyes. "That's not what I said." "No?" she replied, "because so far, every inconsistency has been blamed on staffers, judges, bureaucrats, or Democrats. You've taken credit for the decisions, but not the results." She flipped the final page of her binder. "Leadership," she repeated, "means owning both." The stillness returned. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't a viral soundbite. This was a reckoning wrapped in calm. Trump glanced away from the screen toward something off camera. Maybe a handler. Maybe a clock. Crockett didn't press the silence. She allowed it to breathe. Then, after a moment, she said quietly, "I have no further questions at this time." And just like that, the tension cracked, not with shouting, not with applause, but with a silence so complete, it felt like the hearing had exhaled for the first time. The committee chair called for a recess. The gavel tapped once. The hearing was technically paused, but no one moved. Not at first. Journalists in the back row glanced at each other, wordlessly confirming what they'd just witnessed. Their fingers returned to keyboards not out of routine, but necessity. The story was already writing itself. Staffers shuffled papers, whispering. Phones buzzed in bags and pockets. Social media had erupted the moment Crockett uttered that final line. But inside that room it was still quiet, because everyone present understood something had just shifted. Donald Trump remained on the screen, visibly unsettled. He adjusted his posture, straightened his tie, looked off screen again. Gone was the smugness. The dismissiveness had cracked, replaced by a look he rarely wore in public. Restraint. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't sit back with triumph. She simply gathered her papers methodically, calmly, as though what had just happened was routine. For her, perhaps it was. This wasn't about victory. It was about truth. And she had delivered it. One page at a time. Outside the chamber, it was a different story. Clips were already trending. The word authenticity was spreading like wildfire, quoted, tweeted, dissected. The moment she let it hang in the air, unadorned by flair or theatrics, had struck a chord with people who had waited years to see someone confront power, not with volume, but with clarity. By the time Crockett stepped out of the hearing room, her name was being uttered in households, classrooms, corporate boardrooms, and back rooms of local organizations across the country. Political analysts scrambled to put a label on what they had seen. Some tried calling it a masterclass in oversight. Others called it an unexpected takedown. But the most accurate descriptions didn't come from pundits, they came from everyday people. "She didn't break a sweat," one woman wrote. "She just held up the truth like a mirror and let him see himself." "She didn't fight fire with fire," said another. "She let his own words burn." Older women, especially those who had worked decades in systems built to dismiss them, flooded social media with reactions that felt like personal catharsis. One retired executive posted a clip of the hearing with a caption that simply read, "This is how you do it. Precision over performance, dignity over drama. In homes across the country, daughters watched with their mothers. Some cried, others sat in silence. All of them recognized the moment, not as something new, but something long overdue. Meanwhile, communication experts wasted no time. Clips from the hearing began appearing in virtual classrooms, public relations webinars, and law school lecture halls. One professor at a major university paused her lesson on rhetorical strategy mid-slide and played Crockett's final question to Trump. "Listen to this," she said. "No shouting, no posturing, just direct evidence, structured reasoning, and an undeniable command of the room. This isn't debate. This is surgical discourse." A corporate communication coach posted a breakdown that went viral overnight. She highlighted Crockett's techniques: strategic pausing, documentation-based questioning, control of tempo, redirection of attacks, and refusal to mirror the opponent's emotional tone. "This is the toolkit," she said. "When power tries to rattle you, don't rattle. When ego gets loud, go silent. When they try to make it personal, make it factual." For many women in leadership, the hearing was more than political, it was spiritual. It was a validation of the techniques they had spent years honing. It was proof that strategic composure, often dismissed as passive or weak, could in fact wield devastating strength. But it wasn't just women who noticed. Young law students flooded forums and message boards with questions like, "Can someone teach a course just on this hearing?" Political science majors clipped quotes and pinned them to digital whiteboards. Professors reshuffled syllabi overnight to include this as a case study. Even in the White House press room, reporters began referencing it. One asked a senior aide, "Do you believe today's hearing has redefined the tone of congressional oversight?" The aide deflected, but the question had already landed. For Trump, the aftermath was less celebratory. Supporters tried spinning it. She was rehearsed. She was reading a script. But those excuses didn't gain much traction because what had cut through wasn't the delivery. It was the substance. The contradiction between what he claimed and what his administration had documented was no longer abstract. It was visible, audible, shareable, and undeniable. And for the first time in a long while, his go-to tactics, dismiss, distract, demean, had not only failed, but backfired. Meanwhile, in communities that rarely see themselves represented in rooms of power, Crockett's performance was nothing short of personal. One 63-year-old former nurse from Atlanta posted, "Watching her was like watching my younger self walk into all those rooms I wasn't supposed to be in, and finally speak." Others shared stories of being told to be less aggressive, more agreeable, to smile more, to not challenge authority. Crockett had flipped that script. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make it personal. But she didn't bend either. She proved that clarity, preparation, and conviction could hold their own, even when facing one of the most practiced political performers of our time. And she did it with grace. That grace would go on to echo far beyond Capitol Hill. HR directors referenced it in conflict resolution seminars. Diversity trainers brought it into corporate workshops. Parent groups discussed it at school board meetings. Because what Crockett had done wasn't just challenge Trump. She had modeled a new kind of strength. One built not on dominance, but on control. Not on shouting, but on stillness. Not on rage, but on reason. And perhaps most importantly, not on the need to be believed, but on the certainty that the facts would speak for themselves. In the days that followed, the hearing became more than a news cycle. It became a case study, a cultural moment, a turning point. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's calm dismantling of Trump's defense played on every platform. Not because it was fiery. Not because it was dramatic, but because it showed something rare. A woman holding power accountable without raising her voice, without breaking her composure, and without veering off the truth. People weren't just watching. They were studying. They were saving. They were sharing. The phrase strategic dignity became shorthand for what they had witnessed. Not since the earliest congressional confrontations had the public seen this level of restraint paired with impact. It wasn't the kind of political theater that makes headlines and fizzles. It was deeper. A controlled burn that left behind only truth, and truth, when spoken so plainly, has a way of unsettling even the loudest lies. Workshops started incorporating the hearing into their curriculum. How to maintain control in hostile environments. Evidence-based confrontation. De-escalation without surrender. They used Crockett's dialogue not as inspiration, but as blueprint. In law schools across the country, professors played recordings of the exchange during trial advocacy sessions. This, one instructor told his students, is how you win when you're outnumbered. Not by being louder, but by being unshakable. Meanwhile, the hashtag #NullerAuthenticity continued to trend, but it wasn't being used for memes or slogans. It was being used for moments. Moments where people across the country began applying Crockett's approach to their own lives. A high school teacher posted that she had modeled a classroom discussion on Crockett's structure. We stayed on topic, we stuck to facts, we didn't argue, and guess what? The students listened. A mother shared a story of confronting a school principal over a discriminatory policy. I didn't yell. I brought documents. I stayed calm. And when he tried to talk over me, I paused, just like she did. A corporate whistleblower, previously scared to speak up, shared internal reports using the same structure. Fact, pause, question. Her voice played in my head the whole time, the caption read. Not the sound of it, the shape of it. And still, Crockett herself said little. When approached by reporters after the hearing, she didn't give grand statements. She didn't claim victory. She simply said, I asked the questions I was sent here to ask. That's my job. That humility, that clarity, only amplified the moment's meaning. Because this wasn't about political points. It wasn't even about Donald Trump. It was about what it means to hold someone accountable who believes they never will be. It was about speaking when you're expected to remain silent, and doing it so well that silence becomes your ally. Even Trump's usual defenders had difficulty spinning the hearing into a win. They tried, of course, called her cold, said she lacked emotion, claimed the documents were cherry-picked, but none of it stuck. Because the documents were his. The words were his. And all Crockett had done was hold them up and let the public read them for themselves. The hearing didn't need a winner. It already had a purpose, and it had left behind something that no amount of spin could erase. Contradiction made visible. In quiet corners of government, the effect rippled. Staffers began organizing their oversight presentations differently. They talked more about sequence and delivery. They began preparing for resistance, not with fire, but with facts. One congressional aide was overheard saying, "Forget shouting matches. Give me Crockett's binder and 10 uninterrupted minutes. And outside of government? The ripple was personal. Women over 50 shared their experiences with each other, times when they had been interrupted, dismissed, spoken over, and how they had learned, like Crockett, to breathe through it, to document everything, to pause with power. Watching her was like watching years of training pay off, one former district manager wrote. We weren't crazy, we were just patient. Younger professionals, especially women of color, saw something else. Representation paired with mastery. A black woman leading with intellect, not showmanship. Not apologizing for being assertive. Not shrinking under attack, not changing her voice to be palatable. One woman posted she didn't lean in, she stood still. The moment began to crystallize as more than political. It became symbolic. That there is strength in staying focused. That there is power in being prepared. That you don't have to match aggression to overcome it. And that sometimes, the most revolutionary thing you can do in a system built to shout over you is to whisper facts with a steady hand. For Donald Trump, the hearing was a rare moment of vulnerability caught on national broadcast. Not because he had been destroyed, not because of any viral soundbite, but because for once his usual playbook hadn't worked. And that's what made it historic. He had tried every tactic, mockery, denial, redirection, offense, and one by one they had slid off Crockett like rain on glass. Not because she fought harder, but because she refused to fight on his terms. He walked in expecting noise. She gave him clarity. He delivered volume. She returned silence. He tried to perform. She presented the record. And when it was done, there was no explosion, just revelation. Because, in the end, what stayed with people wasn't what Trump said. It was what he couldn't say. It was the silence after her final question, the blank stare, the absence of spin. That was the moment everyone remembered, and long after the headlines faded and the news cycle moved on, that moment remained. A reminder that authenticity doesn't require approval. It requires evidence, dignity, and the courage to sit in truth even when the room isn't built for it, especially then. Weeks after the hearing, its impact hadn't waned. It had deepened. It wasn't just a trending clip anymore. It had taken root in the national conversation, a permanent reference point for how truth, spoken plainly, can shift power without ever shouting. Jasmine Crockett hadn't gone on a media tour. She hadn't weaponized the moment for sound bites. Her silence outside the chamber was just as deliberate as her calm within it. And that only made the resonance stronger. Editorials appeared in major newspapers, not praising her style, but studying it, not framing her as a political rising star, but as something rarer, a new model for public confrontation. A model where the aim wasn't to win headlines, but to lay foundations, truth over time, not noise in the moment. One national columnist put it best. She didn't try to dominate the room, she redefined it. Think pieces poured in. Former federal judges, civil rights leaders, and organizational psychologists alike weighed in. They spoke not only of her mastery of legal strategy, but of her psychological command of space and time. How she had used silence like a scalpel. How she never allowed Trump's volume to alter her pace. How she trained the nation's ear to listen to restraint. The word recalibration came up again and again. The recalibration of what strength looks like. Of how women in leadership are measured. Of what it means to stand firm without becoming loud. And in this recalibration, something else happened. Something subtle. The public's barometer shifted. Interviews with voters in suburban districts, people who claimed to tune out political noise, revealed an interesting trend. Many hadn't watched the entire hearing, but they had seen the moment. The stillness. The silence after the word authenticity was spoken, and it had stayed with them. One man said she didn't embarrass him. She made him visible. Another added, "I've worked under leaders like that. And I've worked under the other kind too." You know which one gets remembered. In offices, churches, classrooms, anywhere where power dynamics silently define behavior, people began to tell stories. Stories of moments when they too had chosen to speak softly while holding the truth. When they had been told to be nicer, quieter, less confrontational, only to find that control didn't mean shrinking. It meant choosing. Crockett had shown what choosing could look like. And while Trump and his circle scrambled to reframe the hearing as another witch hunt, their rebuttals lacked oxygen. Because this time, there had been no screaming match to push against. No insults to amplify. Just facts, slowly, calmly presented until they formed a wall. Even cable news, so often addicted to theatrics, began to shift in tone when replaying the exchange. Some anchors spoke in softer voices. Others let longer pauses hang. The style of her delivery had left an imprint on the format itself. And perhaps the most lasting effect was the internal one, the mirror it forced others to hold up. Because in the halls of power, where too often volume is mistaken for vision, and aggression for competence, Crockett had stood still and reminded them, you don't have to outshout someone to outclass them. You don't have to be angry to be devastating. You just have to be prepared and unmoved. Behind closed doors, congressional staffers rewatched the hearing to understand how she'd done it. Not just the questions, but the pacing, the restraint, the trust in her preparation. She wasn't trying to catch him, one staffer said. She was documenting him. And documentation, as Crockett knew, is harder to escape than opinion. As for Trump, the ripple of that moment followed him into every subsequent appearance. It wasn't that he had been caught lying. It was that he had been asked over and over to explain his own words and couldn't. For a man who had always controlled the narrative, that was the real break. That someone had taken his tools, his deflection, his bravado, his performance, and simply stepped out of their reach. Viewers didn't leave the hearing with a partisan reaction. They left with a question. Why didn't he have answers? That question began to echo. And as it did, something else began to rise. A different model for how to hold the powerful accountable. One that didn't require shouting, spectacle, or shame. Just evidence. Just poise. Just someone brave enough to believe that when you show up fully prepared and stay exactly where you are, the truth has no choice but to speak louder than everything else. In one particularly powerful interview, Crockett was asked what she hoped people took away from the hearing. She didn't pause to gather her thoughts. She didn't rehearse a headline. She simply said, "I hope people saw what it looks like when someone refuses to let noise become truth." And with that, she ended the interview. No victory lap. No triumphant exit. Just the same silence she had used to unmake a presidency's narrative. One word, one page, one pause at a time. Because that's the lesson she taught us all. That power isn't how loud you speak. It's how long your truth echoes after you've said nothing at all.